Well, you can tell Alan's not here because my fancy stuff doesn't work. Oh, I thought you weren't here. It's not Alan's fault. Man, I feel like I've been to Mass, all that getting up and sitting down. Some of y'all have never done that. It's never mind. All right. Well, good morning. You know, this morning is Valentine's Day, and so there's a lot of love in the air. I had a nice, sweet Valentine's sermon started, and everything was going to be loving and all that kind of stuff. And, you know, God just put it on my heart that, first of all, there's a lot of us who may not have our Valentine with us this morning, whether it's because of death or divorce or whatever circumstances, travel, you know, there's all kind of reasons. And so I decided, I don't know if I'm going to go there. And then I went, last week I started a series on David. So the next chapter, we finished up in chapter 16. The next chapter, chapter 17, is a little bit inappropriate for Valentine's Day. I don't know. I mean, it's a story that you all know. We've all heard it 1,000 times. We've heard it so many times that it's become almost cliche. It's a part of our culture. It's in newspapers and all over the world. You see it as a metaphor for the little guy taking on the big guy. And for the political fight of the underdog taking on the incumbent, or in lawsuits of the small business taking on the giant conglomerate. And you hear that over and over and over and over. The story of David and Goliath. If you went out on the street and you asked somebody cold off the street, what do you know about the biblical David, the king of Israel in the Bible? They would invariably say two names, David and Goliath, or David and Bathsheba. This story is one of those that is interwoven. Movies have replayed this story over and over and over. And not just the literal, but the metaphor version of this story. But this morning, I really want to take a different light. Because most of you have heard enough sermons about conquering your personal giants, or that if God is on your side, you'll be able to conquer the giant, to the point that you could probably stand up here and preach those yourself. And so this morning, I want to look at it in a little bit of a different light. I want to talk about church. I want to specifically talk about Eastside. And I want to talk about how this story relates to us. Because many of you have heard me say, I believe with all my heart that 2016 is a pivotal year for the Eastside Church of Christ. I believe we are at a crossroads. We are at a place where we have to make some serious choices about our influence in this town and in the world around us. I believe we have an amazing opportunity to step out in faith and to follow where God is leading. And I believe this is a pivotal time for us. I believe it's a very similar situation to where the Israelites found themselves in 1 Samuel 17. If you want to follow along and flip over there, in 1 Samuel 17, the Israelites are camped out at a place called the Valley of Elah. And the way this works is on one side are the Philistines. The Philistines control the coastline and the plains. As we talked about last week, those Philistines have iron weapons. They have chariots with swords on the wheels that thunder across the plains. And they rule the plains and the coastline. On the opposite hill, though, are the Israelites. The Israelites are famous for their archers, for their arrows, that they control the hill country, because you can't drive one of those iron chariots through the hill country of Israel. And so the Israelites camp out over here because this is their place. This is their land. They control it and they're defending it. That hill country, those rocks and crevices are perfect for ambushes for Israelite archers. And so we're kind of at a stalemate where both sides are staring at each other, and in the middle is this valley, the Valley of Elah. So that's where we find ourselves at the beginning of chapter 17. Now, I believe that we are very similar in a place in the church today. I believe we're kind of at a stalemate. I believe there are forces that control the world, and they have, the powers and principalities have their strongholds. And I believe on the other side there are Christians and there are churches, and these churches have their stronghold. And nobody's engaging. We're staring at each other across the Valley of Elah. Now eventually a champion comes out. That's what the Bible calls Goliath. Goliath is a great giant. A giant that makes the people of God run and hide. The Israelites, we're told in 1 Samuel chapter 17, verse 11, were dismayed and greatly afraid. That giant, we have those still today, don't we? As the church stares at the world across this great divide, occasionally a giant comes out. And the giant struts his stuff and says, "Isn't there anyone who is brave enough to come face me?" And like Saul and the Israelites, we are greatly dismayed and afraid. You know, that giant for us may be cancer. It may be death. It may be one of those giants that we're terrified of facing. You'll see Christians who are eager to pray for God's healing for a common cold. But when you're faced with someone with cancer, they pray, "God, your will be done." Because that giant of things like HIV and AIDS is scary to us. And we're dismayed and greatly afraid. Maybe that giant is addiction. And that's the giant that we can't face. Maybe it's homes being torn apart by adultery. Maybe it's the unspoken abuse, whether it be spousal abuse or child abuse or whatever. But we have these giants that come out and face the world, and we're afraid. And so we stare at each other across this Valley of Elah. We, like Saul and the Israelites, tighten our ranks and cower in fear. The Bible calls Goliath a champion. That's literally, the Hebrew word carries the meaning of a man who goes out in between. And if you remember the story, which I'm sure most of you do, Goliath's proposition to the Israelites is that if you have somebody that is brave enough to come out and face me, then we'll just settle this man to man. And whoever wins will be the master of the other. And so I still submit that that's happening today. That those giants, whether they be oil prices or ISIS or politics or whatever, stands and says, "Why don't you, Christians, send someone out to face me, and whoever wins will be the master of the other." The Philistines had a champion. They had a man who went between. The Israelites should have had one in Saul. Saul is the anointed of God. Saul is God's chosen man in that situation. And what is Saul doing? He's hiding in his tent just like everybody else. So there are a few things that I want us to look at this morning, because I think the church is the anointed of God. I think the church is the champion that's supposed to go out into these battles. I think that's our calling and that's our place. And there are a few things that we need to gather from this story about how to do that. The first one is bring the sandwiches. Bring the sandwiches. David doesn't leave the sheep that morning to go slay a giant, become a national hero, marry the king's daughter. He goes to bring sandwiches. His dad says, son, leave the sheep, take this basket of food to the front lines to your brothers, and bring me back some token to show me that they're okay. And you know what David says? David says, well, Dad, that's not really my gift. I'm more of a worship guy. Can you get somebody else to bring the sandwiches? Because that's not my thing. And I don't really want to do that right now. Or David says, you know, Dad, I'm just swamped at work with all these sheep. I don't have time to bring sandwiches. You know, I appreciate that you need that done, but I'm sure there are other people who are more qualified to take sandwiches. David takes the sandwiches. And God blesses that by making him his instrument that saves Israel. The champion, the hero, because he brought the sandwiches. I say that this morning because I think that there are things that we need to realize. That when you're making coffee in Common Grounds, you're making coffee for God. That when Bob and Jeanette are serving you Hilltoppers food, they are serving Jesus Christ. And whatever it is, when you're teaching a 3- and 4-year-old class, you're teaching Jesus. We got to bring the sandwiches. A lot of times we think, well, that's not my giftedness, that's not my place, that's not my calling. But like David, if we're just faithful, if we just do what needs to be done, God can glorify that obedience. So the first thing we have to think about to be a champion church is to bring the sandwiches. The second thing is you've got to ignore the scorn of your brothers. When David gets to the front lines, he meets up with his brother Eliab. Now, if you remember from the previous chapters, Eliab is the one that Samuel looks at and says, surely this is the Lord's anointed. He's the oldest, and in that culture, the oldest got all the blessings. He is the good-looking one. He's the tall one. He's the handsome one. And apparently, from what we see in chapter 17, he's the one that's still jealous that his little runt brother got anointed and he didn't. Because when David comes to the battle, David hears Goliath and he says, what's the king going to do for whoever goes out and faces this Philistine? And you know what Eliab says? I know you. You're just out here to be seen. You're just trying to do this so people will say, oh, look at what a great guy David is. Now here's the pivotal point. Because I think that still happens. I think Satan still uses the arrogance, the greed, the selfishness, the self-righteousness of brothers today to drag other people down who are trying to do things for the kingdom. If David would have stopped right then and launched into a theological debate with Eliab about how he should address a giant, the giant would still be raging. If David had taken the time to say, you know, Eliab, let's table this giant fighting and let's address your fears because I want you to be on board here. I want you to be on my side. I want you to understand what I'm doing. David doesn't do that. David turns away, the Bible says, to another. So how do we face that? We keep our focus on God first of all. Because that's where David's focus is. It's not on his brother. And then he turns away from him toward another and says the same thing again. Because David doesn't stop doing what he's doing because it makes Eliab uncomfortable. David doesn't stop doing what he's doing because Eliab's own heart issues are impugned on David's motives. David maintains his focus. The third thing that we have to do to be a champion, to be a church that can go between with the world, is we can't fight in borrowed armor. See, Saul tries to help David because Saul has a bit of guilt of his own. Here is the king, the one who is a head taller than any man in Israel, the anointed one of God, who should be out there fighting the giant, yet is hiding in his tent. And when David comes to him and says, I want to go do that, Saul says, well, okay, if you're going to go, here, let me give you all this stuff because it's worked for me in the past. And so he starts to put that stuff on him. And he starts to load him up. And what happens? David says, I can't fight in this. That happens to us today. Because today, there are still people of God who are good-hearted and who want to face the giant, but they're trying to put their armor on the next generation. And they're saying here, you know, in 1951 we did it this way, and we were very successful. But a new generation can't fight that way. You can't fight in borrowed armor. You've got to fight in your own way, just like David. You've got to face the giant in your own terms with the power of God, not with the borrowed armor of somebody else. Because David is successful. David goes out and says, he faces that giant and says to him in verse 46 and 47 that God is going to deliver you into my hand so that all the earth may know there is a God in Israel. And that all this assembly may know that the Lord saves not with sword and spear. Why? For the battle is the Lord's and He will give you into our hand. That's where we're at. We're at that crossroads where we've got to decide, are we going to go out and face the giant, or are we going to hide and maintain our position? That's called being a champion. And that's what we're being called to. I was telling people about this morning, about this sermon this morning, this week, and they laughed at me. How are you going to preach on David and Goliath on Valentine's Day? And I said, well, David and Goliath is a love story. David and Goliath is a story about love. Let me tell you what I mean, because if you read through the Bible, it's not a collection of stories. It's not a who's who. It's not a comic book. It's not the Avengers. It's the story of God and how God has ministered to His people across centuries. And the hero of that story doesn't show up until the New Testament, but he's referred to throughout the entire book. And so here's David. The people of God are besieged. They're frightened and cowardly, hiding from a giant who oppresses them. David is sent by his father to the battlefield. He offers to fight, but he's scorned, rejected, and mocked by his own people. Yet he persists and eventually becomes a substitute for his people, even though they scorned him. David is a gentle shepherd. He's not a full-grown man. And when he goes out against this giant, I'm sure he appears to those onlookers like a lamb being led to slaughter. But David in his weakness becomes the champion redeemer of all Israel. He saves the people of God. His victory is fully imputed to every person in the household of God. By his work, literally all Israel is saved. And in this shepherd's tale, we see the foreshadowing of a greater shepherd. In this shepherd's tale, we see a foreshadowing of Jesus Christ. That's why all those sermons about how if we just face our giants, we can be successful. All those sermons about how if I just step out and I can be the hero, we're not the hero of this story. We are the people hiding in their tents, scared to death, facing certain slavery and death. And instead of trying to be the champion, instead of trying to be the hero, we need to worship Him. This story is hearkening to a greater story that God knows is coming. And all through Scripture, not just here, He's going to give glimpses. He's like a parent waiting for Christmas morning because He really wants you to see what's coming. Because I am those people hiding in a tent, scared to death. Facing slavery, facing death, facing those giants that we talked about before that we know we can't overcome. Death, addiction, adultery, abuse, all those things that loom over us that we're so afraid of that have already been vanquished. The champion's already come. The battle's over. It's just up to us to run out there and join in the spoils. That's love. That's love that you won't find on a Valentine's card or in a box of chocolates. This morning, that's the love that calls to you. And if you haven't accepted that, if you haven't submitted yourself to that through baptism, if you haven't come to Jesus, it's time. It's time. Stop trying to face those giants by yourself. That call this morning is for you. That call is also for this church. That we're going to step out in faith. That we are going to be the champions this city is dying for. That we're going to grow in faith, to bring hope to a dying world, and to be known by our love. And to do that, we have to be a champion church. Whatever we can do to help you this morning, that's what we're here for. That's what a champion church does. And so when we sing this song, there are going to be elders and their wives at the back of the building. They are there to pray with you, to lift you up, to go to the Father, because we don't have any power in ourselves. There's a private prayer room over here. If you want to go and share those concerns with somebody and have them pray over you right now, today, that's what this time is for. That's what we're here for. Whatever we can do to assist you, I encourage you. Come now, while together we stand and sing.